In the summer of 1944, American tank crews kept running into the same nightmare. They'd push through a gap in the hedgerows, spot movement ahead, and then the first hit would come from a gun they couldn't even see, slamming into the front of a Sherman. Panthers and Tigers were appearing more often. Their long-barreled guns could reach out farther. Their sloped armor shrugged off shots that, on paper, should have worked. The U.S. Army had plenty of tanks. It just increasingly had the wrong tank at the right time. What most of those crews didn't know was that, back in the United States, a very different machine was already on the test track. Lower, better armored, armed with a 90mm gun designed to kill modern German tanks frontally. The project had a name, T-26, and history would remember it as the M26 Pershing. The concept was there as early as 1943. The gun existed. The need was obvious. But by the time Pershings finally rolled into German cities in 1945, the war in Europe was nearly over. So in this episode, we're going to ask a simple but uncomfortable question. The US knew it needed a big cat killer in 1943. So why did the M26 Pershing arrive too late for World War II? By the second half of 1944, American tank units had an uncomfortable pattern in their after-action reports. Against Panzer IVs and Stugs, the M4 Sherman could hold its own, especially once the newer 76mm guns and better ammunition showed up. Crews knew how to fight those opponents. Use numbers, use maneuver, stay moving, and hit them from the side when possible. But against Panthers and Tigers, the margin for error was tiny. Crews complained about having to close the distance, maneuver onto the flanks under fire, and accept heavy losses whenever the terrain favored the Germans. Those tactical frustrations were rooted in a particular way the US Army saw its own armor. Medium tanks like the Sherman were not, on paper, designed as dedicated tank killers. They were meant to support infantry, exploit breakthroughs, and keep moving. The job of fighting enemy tanks was supposed to belong to a separate tank destroyer force, with towed or self-propelled guns, 3-inch and 90mm weapons positioned to ambush approaching armor. On a doctrinal slide, that division of labor looked tidy. Out in the bocage and the forests, it often meant the wrong gun was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Tank units ended up fighting German armor whether they were supposed to or not, and they did it in machines that were increasingly outmatched frontally. By the winter of 1944-45, especially after the surprise and shock of the Ardennes offensive, the European command was sending sharper and sharper messages back to Washington. We need heavier armor, we need a gun that can kill a Panther frontally, and we need it now. The irony is that somewhere in Detroit and on the test tracks at Aberdeen, the outlines of that answer were already sitting under tarps. The Pershing didn't appear out of nowhere in 1945. Its story really starts in 1942, just as the first Shermans were entering production. The U.S. Ordnance Department knew from the beginning that the M4 was, in many ways, a stopgap. It had a relatively high hull. Its turret ring was narrow. Its suspension and transmission were proven, but not ideal for endless upgunning and extra armor. There wasn't much room to grow. Engineers began work on what was called the T-20 series, a family of experimental tanks, T-20, T-22, T-23, that tried out new transmissions, lower silhouettes, and eventually new guns. These prototypes still carried 75mm or 76mm guns, but that wasn't the point. They were test beds for a next-generation American tank. On drawing boards and test rigs, you can already see the DNA of Pershing: lower and better sloped armor than the Sherman, a wider turret ring to accept bigger guns, and torsion bar suspension instead of the Sherman's familiar vertical volute springs. The US was essentially practicing for a future, heavier fighting vehicle while the standard M4 carried the burden overseas. By 1943, combat experience from North Africa and early encounters with the Tiger pushed things further. Ordnance proposed tanks that were no longer just better Shermans, but something clearly in a heavier class. Two new designs appeared: the T-25 and the T-26. The T-25 was a medium tank with a 90mm gun and Panther-like armor. The T-26 carried similar firepower with even heavier protection, and was edging into what everyone now had to admit was heavy tank territory. On paper, by 1943, the heart of the Pershing, the hull layout, torsion bar suspension, big turret ring, and the 90mm gun M3 already existed. The basic concept was there. The need was becoming obvious. So why were American crews still fighting Panthers in Shermans in 1944? This is where the story leaves the test track and heads into the conference room. The first big reason the Pershing arrived late has nothing to do with steel or engines. It has to do with doctrine and bureaucracy. Inside the U.S. Army, two powerful institutions clashed over tank development. On one side was the Ordnance Department, which designed, tested, and built the hardware. On the other was Army Ground Forces under General Leslie McNair, which set doctrine, training, and defined what the Army actually needed. On the Ordnance side, you had people like Gladion Barnes and, early on, Jacob Devers of the Armored Force, officers who had watched German tank development closely and wanted a heavier-armed, better-protected tank with a 90mm gun. They looked at the T-26 and saw the logical successor to the Sherman and the answer to future German armor. McNair and Army Ground Forces saw something else. To them, heavy tanks looked like trouble. McNair's priorities were mobility and reliability over sheer armor thickness, standardization and simplicity instead of multiple tank families, and continued faith in tank destroyer doctrine to handle enemy armor. The T-26 looked heavy, slow, maintenance-intensive, and logistically awkward. It would overload some bridges, complicate shipping, and soak up production capacity that could otherwise turn out more Shermans and more tank destroyers. So throughout 1943, every time Ordnance pushed for large-scale production orders for the T-26, Army Ground Forces pushed back. "We don't need a heavy tank," was the message. "Improve the Sherman, build more tank destroyers." As German armor evolved and reports trickled in from Europe and the Mediterranean, this argument got sharper. Ordnance, pointing to what they expected to face in future campaigns, requested production runs for the T-23, T-25, and T-26. McNair resisted. According to post-war research relying heavily on ordnance files, General Devers eventually went around McNair and took the case straight to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall. On December 16, 1943, Marshall sided with Ordnance. He approved the production of 250 T-26E1 tanks, effectively overruling McNair's objections and giving the heavy tank program a green light. On the surface, that looks like the turning point, the moment the U.S. decided to build its Panther-killer. But when you look at the timing, you start to see the problem. That decision came late in 1943. The design still needed refinement. Factories still had to tool up, suppliers still had to be lined up, and Army Ground Forces did not simply vanish from the process. Their skepticism translated into requirements for more tests, more proofs, more incremental changes, each of which cost time. Even with Marshall's approval, the T-26 had to prove it could actually work in the field. Remember, the T-20 family wasn't just a Sherman with more armor. Under the armor, it used new transmissions, new suspension, a heavier turret, and a brand new 90mm gun. All of that changed weight distribution, recoil forces, and maintenance demands. Trials at Aberdeen and Fort Knox quickly revealed plenty of issues: overheating and transmission failures, suspension problems under heavy loads, and reliability questions compared to the simple, well-understood Sherman mechanisms. For ordnance engineers, these were normal teething troubles, the kind you fix while production is ramping up. For Army Ground Forces, they were red flags, evidence that the T-26 should be kept in the experimental category until every glitch was ironed out. The result was not a crash program, but a cautious, stop-start development cycle. Test, tweak, retest, file paperwork, build small pilot batches, then test again. Meanwhile, the Sherman kept rolling off production lines by the thousands. Only in late 1944 did things finally come together. An improved configuration was standardized as the T-26E3. Ordnance committees judged it far superior to any existing American tank of similar weight and speed. At that point, production orders started to translate into real vehicles. But calendars matter. By the time the T-26E3 was standardized, the war in Europe was already deep into its final year. Standardization doesn't magically put tanks on ships. Factories had to reconfigure. Workers had to be trained. Suppliers had to deliver components that were themselves new and untested. Full production of the T-26E3 only truly began in November 1944. In the first month, only a handful of tanks rolled out. The numbers grew, and by the end of 1945 around 2,200 Pershings would exist, but that was after Germany had surrendered. To get the new tank into combat as quickly as possible, Ordnance organized a special deployment. A technical team led by General Gladion Barnes, escorting an initial batch of 20 T-26E3s to Europe in early 1945. This was the so-called Zebra mission. Those tanks arrived in 1st U.S. Army, were split between the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions, and first went into action in late February 1945 on the Roer River front. From there, they fought through to the Rhine and beyond. In the famous footage from Cologne, a Pershing squares off against a Panther in a shattered city square and wins in front of a rolling film camera. More Pershings follow behind that first batch. In total, around 300 T-26E3s will be shipped to Europe before the German surrender. Roughly 200 actually reached frontline units. And of those, only the first handful, maybe 20 or so tanks, saw sustained, recorded combat before the war ended. Individually, they did what they were designed to do. The 90mm gun could handle Panthers and Tigers at typical combat ranges. The armor was competitive. Crews liked the low silhouette and smoother ride compared to the Sherman. In the Cologne Street duel and in smaller actions elsewhere, Pershings proved that the concept worked. But operationally, they arrived in numbers too small and too late to change the big picture. By the time the Pershing was finally doing the job it had been sketched for on paper, killing German tanks, the German army was collapsing on all fronts, strangled by fuel shortages, air attacks, and sheer attrition. That brings us back to the uncomfortable question: could this have gone differently? Could Pershings have been fighting in Normandy, or at least in larger numbers in late 1944? Could more Sherman crews have had that 90mm gun and thicker armor under them before the worst of the fighting was over? Some critics, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, argue that the answer is yes. They point out that American engineers were working on heavier designs as early as 1942. They note that the 90mm gun existed and that Ordnance requested more ambitious production runs that were turned down. They suggest that, if the Army had prioritized the T-26 earlier, it might have been in full production by mid-1944. Others are more cautious. They emphasize how real the technical problems were in the early T-20 series. They remind us that no tank, including the Sherman, rolled off the line perfectly. They stress the risk of switching the entire American armored force over to an unproven drivetrain and suspension in the middle of the war. And they point to the sheer momentum of the Sherman program. Factories, training, spare parts, and logistics all built around a known design. Any sharp turn away from that would have meant fewer tanks in the short term, at a time when quantity still mattered enormously. The truth probably sits somewhere between those poles. The people in charge believed their doctrine made sense. They believed the Sherman, supported by tank destroyers, was good enough. And they believed that stability in production was more important than chasing every new idea from the test range. In the end, the Pershing's lateness was not the fault of a single villain or a single bad decision. It was the product of doctrines that underestimated how much tank versus tank combat medium tanks would end up doing, of bureaucratic friction between the men who designed tanks and the men who wrote field manuals, of genuine technical challenges in bringing a new generation of tank hardware into production, and of a wartime production system that was optimized for the Sherman and did not like to be disturbed. By early 1945, when Pershings finally roll across the Rhine, all of those factors have finally grudgingly lined up. The wrong tank at the right time is no longer alone. A better armed, better armored successor has arrived. It's just that the war it was built for is almost over. The United States never lacked the ability to design a Panther-killer. What it lacked in 1943 and 1944 was the will to break its own habits, doctrinal habits, bureaucratic habits, industrial habits, fast enough to put that tank into the field when it mattered most.